Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter.
You're watching BBC2.
BBC2 is a channel that we may take for granted today. For generations now, the sister channel to the elder statesman, BBC1, has provided countless hours of entertainment for viewers, whether it's programming supplementing or complementing shows from its big brother, or showcasing alternative, often fascinating shows instead. No matter what your preference, we've all probably tuned into at least one programme that BBC2 has offered us over the decades. But 60 years ago, it was a common question as to whether the channel would get off the ground at all. In the black and white days of 1960s television, the landscape was vastly different, and the arrival of a new channel was treated like some sort of groundbreaking event. This is the story of the rather disastrous launch of BBC2.
The vision and sound are on. The station goes on the air.
By the time the 1960s had begun, BBC television was barely a quarter of a century old, and it had been off the airwaves for at least a fifth of that time. Its first few years, from 1936 to 1939, largely consisted of the BBC team figuring out how this new medium was going to work. People could purchase sets to tune in, but like with most new technologies, a high price point and skepticism about the new medium resulted in slow sales. Plus, really, unless you were within the reach of the TV transmitter at Alexandra Palace, you were going to struggle to catch whatever programme the Beeb was putting out. After suspending operations during World War II, BBC television returned in 1946, ready to properly build an empire. By the mid-1950s, it was succeeding in this ambition, with millions of Britons purchasing TV sets, thanks in part due to national events, such as the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. However, the BBC wasn't granted a monopoly forever, and just shy of the television service's 20th anniversary in 1955, a challenger emerged that aimed to do things differently to old Auntie and introduce a new kind of television to British audiences.
Ready all those who have made this possible? Over to Guildhall. Good luck all. Here we go. Take it, Master Control.
Commercial television is here.
Independent television, or ITV, launched with great fanfare, ushering in the American world of commercial television to an audience that had yet to experience it. Much criticism was thrown at the newcomer for this formatting, and indeed much of its programming in the early years was criticised for appealing to what was unflatteringly termed as the lowest common denominator. By the beginning of the 60s, a report was commissioned to address the issues of the current television landscape, and to map out its future for the decade to come. The Pilkington Report, as it came to be known, spent a few years deliberating the future of British broadcasting, but one such prospect, one that would have been seen as enormous for the 1960s, was the introduction of a third television channel, running on the new and improved 625 line system, offering greater definition and, aerials permitting, a clearer picture. Ultimately, the third channel was awarded to the BBC, who, despite gaining some criticism in the Pilkington Report, came off far better than its rival. But now that the Beeb had been awarded this new channel, they actually had to get it up and running.
When BBC2 was announced, i.e. the second channel, an awful lot of those who would be involved were already whacked from the effort of finding a competitive response to ITV. The idea of another channel was, oh my God, not more, you know.
In early 1963, the first controller of what was to be called BBC2 was confirmed. Michael Peacock would be the captain of the ship, so to speak, and quickly he and his team began plans to get the new channel up and running. In preparation for this historic event, much thought was given as to how to inform the public that not only was a new TV channel on the way, but why on earth they should tune in. Keep in mind, these days, you'd just update your telly or set-top box and the new channel would be there ready to go. But back in the 60s, matters weren't quite as simple. Given that BBC2 would be broadcasting 625 lines via UHF instead of the 405 lines on VHF, this meant that the vast majority of existing television sets, the very sets that were in millions of British homes, wouldn't be able to receive the new channel even if the viewers wanted to. Despite the technological push forward with 625-line broadcasting, this presented a potentially massive problem in terms of audience uptake. Not only would viewers have to fork out for a new dual standard television set, one that could receive BBC2, but also existing programmes on BBC1 and ITV, but they would also have to have a new aerial installed. TV by 1963 had come down in price to a somewhat accessible level, but with the majority of sets in the country being rented as opposed to bought, some viewers would have bailed at the increased prices all of this new kit would bring. Nevertheless, adverts in newspapers were soon rolled out showcasing new dual standard TV sets. Take this one, showcasing a model from GEC, with a rather boastful list of what the set can offer the eager viewer who wants to access the new channel. Another aspect for BBC2's launch that was doted upon was the idea of introducing a mascot to represent the newcomer. Whilst mascots representing brands was nothing new, this would be something of a first for BBC Television. The idea ultimately settled on was a pair of kangaroos, the mother named Hullabaloo and its Joey named Custard. Hullabaloo I can understand, there was a great deal of fuss after all surrounding the impending beginning of BBC2, but why was the Joey named Custard?
It was decided that we would have some sort of symbol, and they chose the kangaroo because of BBC One being the mother, and then the little one could be BBC Two. BBC One they called Hullabaloo because it was all to do with promotion, but they couldn't think of a name for BBC Two. And after a long meeting one day, and they still hadn't thought of one, somebody suddenly said, well, why the hell don't we call it Custard, because custard goes with anything.
I'm not so sure about that, Chief, but sure, you do you. The pair of kangaroos began to appear prominently in print advertising, all for the purpose of letting the public know that BBC Two was on its way. By the start of 1964, test transmissions for BBC Two began to get underway. There had been some brief discussion about potentially launching the service in colour, which would have made the UK the first European nation to do so by a country mile. And hey, why not? The BBC had been running experimental test transmissions in colour since the late 1950s. With all that experience, why shouldn't they launch their new service in glorious colour? Well, the idea was soon quashed, as the European standard for colour, which would come to be known as PAL, wasn't quite ready yet, and actually getting some kind of service up and running was ultimately deemed more important. As winter morphed into spring, the fateful day drew nearer. Monday the 20th of April 1964 was marked as launch day, and as the promos for the new 625-line service mounted and more dual standard TV sets appeared in shop windows, the BBC were feeling confident that their new endeavour would prove successful. Rehearsals for the opening programme, lineup, were carried out in earnest, the hosts going over the same 10-minute script again and again, as they, and all involved with BBC Two, wanted the launch to be as smooth and as successful as possible. The hosts were ready, the cameras were ready, all in the control room, albeit slightly nervous, were ready also. Months of preparation, all came down to this. The UK's third television channel was about to start broadcasting. And then it happened.
In London tonight, a massive breakdown at Battersea Power Station brought chaos to the centre of the capital. The power cut was caused by a fire in the giant building, and a score of fire engines was called in to fight the blaze. All over town, traffic lights went out, tubes stopped, and even the Windmill Theatre closed. But the biggest disappointment was at BBC Television Centre, where the curtain failed to go up on the opening night of a brand new channel, BBC Two.
In a rather cruel twist of fate, a massive fire erupted at Battersea Power Station, knocking out power across large swaths of London. This included, crucially, the BBC Television Centre, which was gearing up for the launch of BBC Two. With no power to transmit the inaugural programmes, something had to be done, and fast. The only option was Alexandra Palace, the very place where BBC Television had launched back in 1936. Whilst the purpose-built television centre was now the main hub of BBC operations, Alexandra Palace was still used to some extent. As such, the newsroom at Ali Pali quickly became the central emergency hub for BBC Two. The channel's logo was thrown up hurriedly, and it fell to anchor Gerald Priestland to deliver an unscheduled news bulletin. Except, viewers wouldn't have heard a single word that he said. For the first 3 minutes of this somewhat impromptu broadcast, a fault meant that those viewers who were tuning in were left without sound. Things were truly going from bad to worse. Eventually, the sound issue was resolved, and the first words to be spoken on BBC2 were unfortunately this.
Back home again, that Yorkshire bus conductress who was sacked last week for calling Pakistani passengers stinking has got her job back. Union representatives went to see the management, and the conductress made an apology.
The 1960s, eh? Truly a different time.
Once again, this opening programme of Channel 2 is coming from the Alexandra Palace newsroom, owing to a massive electric failure at the television centre in West London.
You have to commend Gerald Priestland's professionalism here. He's been thrust in front of the cameras last minute to deliver the news in the most haphazard way possible, whilst engineers are frantically trying to get the original BBC2 plan back up and running. He handles it calmly, and with as much grace as possible, so we can give credit where credit's due. What else was going on in April 1964 then, eh Gerald?
The Church of Scotland is recommended to stand firm against commercial sport on Sunday. A committee report is not against taking exercise on Sunday, but it recommends serious thought and reading as proper activities.
Here's a light-hearted one. You have to laugh when it's all going wrong, right?
Finally, a safety note. After free beer was distributed to workmen at the topping out of the new Nottingham University building, the contractors closed down the site for the rest of the day. A spokesman said the men were rather light-hearted and it was thought to be in their best interests.
And it isn't just reading the news, we get outside phone calls.
Excuse me, just like Channel 1. Hello?
Though this is probably management frantically explaining to Gerald what to do or say next.
As you can imagine, there's a good deal of rushing about going on behind the scenes. The London power failure halted underground trains on the central line between Northolt and West Ruislip. So if anyone's not home yet, perhaps that accounts for it. BBC Television Centre, Shepherd's Bush, blacked out 25 minutes before the scheduled start of BBC2's first programme at 7:20. Well, something has started. We are going to repeat this news summary in 1 minute.
After 1 minute of this holding slide, which has gone on to become quite infamous, Gerald pops up on screens once more. He delivers the news again, even having stuff literally handed over by the team behind him. After checking in that no more fresh news has come in...
That is all for the moment, I think. Anything else? That's all we have for the moment.
He signs off to the viewer and the holding slide returns. After a while, it cuts to this, with an announcement to accompany it.
We apologise for this delay in the start of BBC2. There's been a massive electricity supply failure affecting our main studios in West London. The scheduled programmes will begin as soon as we can possibly manage.
Those programmes would not be restored, and the 20th of April 1964, a day that was meant to mark the glorious birth of a new television channel, was instead realised by an impromptu news bulletin and a couple of holding slides. Though not of their own making, this was a colossal disaster and a crushing blow of a launch for the BBC.
We'd attracted the press of the world. I mean, really, I don't know, there were hundreds of press people down there waiting for this great event. And all of a sudden, all the lights went out.
By the following morning, some order had been restored, enough so that BBC2 could start up and transmit its first official programme. Though this was meant to be the lineup the night before, at 7:20 PM, the first programme, airing in the morning of Tuesday the 21st of April, ended up being this.
Here's a house. Here's a door. Windows, 1, 2, 3, 4. Ready to knock? Turn the lock. It's play school.
Yep, you heard correctly. Play School, a beloved children's programme that would go on to air for almost the next quarter century, was the first official programme to debut on BBC2. By the time the evening rolled around, line-up would go out as originally planned, though lead presenter, Dennis Toohey, was allowed to include a fun little gag in reference to the previous night's calamity.
We recognised that, tragic though the first night had been in that it didn't happen, there were comic elements to it too, and a lot of people other than ourselves thought the whole thing was very funny. So perhaps we ought to indicate that we weren't taking ourselves too seriously. Out of which the corny idea of the candle emerged. What it meant for me was simply another afternoon of nerves, because I was quite sure that The longer you correctly rehearse blowing out a candle, the less chance there is that you will actually do it when the time comes.
Good evening. This is BBC2.
I think it was somewhat appropriate that, and ironic that with this new breakthrough into 625 line technology, it was one of the oldest pieces of technology that man has had that started us off and got us going.
I think this was absolutely the right way to start things off. An indication that this new channel would be a bit looser, a bit more relaxed in the way its presenters interacted with one another and the audience.
My name is Dennis Toohey, and this is the lineup studio from which, all being well, BBC programmes, BBC2 programmes will start each evening from now on. And first of all, let me introduce you to some of the elements that go to make up the new service. This is the identification symbol, the hallmark, that you'll be seeing regularly in one form or another. Now I'd like you to meet the lineup team. First of all, my fellow anchorman, John Stone.
As the dark minutes ticked by in the studio last night, I ignored the merry cries of "Bert's pulled the wrong plug" or "Charlie's put the mockers on again." I took comfort in the Daily Sketch horoscope for yesterday, which said, "A feeling that others are against you is unfounded."
And next, the girl who would have been the first woman to have appeared on BBC2 were it not for Play School at 11 o'clock this morning. Programme reporter Pamela Donald.
Ah, yes, but I'll tell you something, and with the Battersea Power Station, please take note, I intend to be the last tonight.
Ironic, really, as a lot of the early programming on BBC2 would nowadays be considered as extremely highbrow. That aside, the presentation style of the hosts was seen as something quite different for 1964. Once lineup concluded, a comedic programme, the Albert's Channel 2, followed. This was a quirky send-up of broadcasting history, one that included yet another candle gag, though presumably this had been set up before the disastrous power failure the night before. A musical followed in the shape of Kiss Me Kate, now regarded as a classic.
A troop of strolling players are we, not stars like L.B. Mayers are we.
And this was then followed by a popular Soviet comedian, and then the fireworks show Off With a Bang, featuring Hullabaloo and Custard, amongst many other impressive displays.
Hello, good evening, Brown Johnston here, and on behalf of Hullabaloo and Custard, welcome to Southend. It's not raining, it's very blustery, but it is a fine night here. And for the next 15 minutes or so, BBC2 is really getting launched with a bang, and I'll do my best to pop in between the pops to tell you something about the fireworks you're going to see and hear. By the way, if your dog's in the room with you, we don't consider this as a suitable programme for him or her.
The newsroom wrapped things up before the lineup returned to see out the day at 11 p.m.
Well, that's all from Close Down tonight. We've certainly had ourselves a ball here. Can we come again tomorrow night, maybe round about 7:20 in lineup? And now, at 1 minute past midnight, may I wish you, on behalf of everyone here on BBC2, a very good night.
So, now it was finally official. BBC2 was up and running. But was it a success? In its early days, BBC2 would have themed nights to make up the schedule. This would be commonly known as the 7 Faces of the Week. So one night, say, could be themed around politics, or another around music, or even a night around education, which led to riveting programmes such as this.
Mathematics 1964. Revolution. These are challenging and possibly frightening words, aren't they? Well, we've got 20 programmes to explain them.
The 7 Faces was partly a positive thought that it gave us the chance to get the most out of what we had. It was also a process of rationalising the fact that we didn't have enough programmes or resources or money to really make a 7-day schedule work properly.
Whilst this may have seemed like a good idea to begin with, it was dropped fairly quickly. This era did produce some fascinating oddities, however, such as this piece, Conversations for Tomorrow, where esteemed author J.B. Priestley entertains guests and encourages debate at his home. It's the most casual yet serious thing in the world, but I can imagine some audiences finding some joy from it, almost like a prehistoric podcast. Programmes aside, what did audiences think? Well, for the first few months, if you wanted someone's opinion, you'd have to go to London or parts of the southeast. See, nowadays, where a new channel can launch nationwide with relative ease, such was not the case in the analogue world. BBC2 was only available in London and the southeast for quite some time, whilst upgrades to transmitting equipment got underway. Even papers from 1964, such as the Radio Times, predicted that 2/3 of the population would be able to receive BBC2 by the winter of 1966-67, a whole 2 years away. By the time BBC2 was expanded to reach more of the UK, the programme remit had expanded also. In the final few years of the 60s, it was showcasing programmes that were not only very popular, but would go on to be seen as amongst the classics of the medium. This includes comedies such as The Likely Lads, and dramas like The Forsyte Saga, seen as a very prestigious endeavour at the time. In 1967, the dream of colour television was finally achieved, as BBC2 became the first television channel in Europe to introduce a colour service, with one of the first programmes to highlight the advancement being the coverage of the 1967 Wimbledon tennis tournament. And who was the controller at the helm? David Attenborough. Yep, that David Attenborough.
On July the 1st, we start colour launching, and those will be advertised programmes, again in our normal monochrome schedule, who've suddenly had colour added to them. And they will be our documentary films, Wicker's World, for example, Man Alive, The Virginian, and also, most importantly, Outside Broadcast.
And as the British TV industry caught up to BBC2, both with the introduction of colour and of 625-line transmissions, the youngest channel would continue to grow from strength to strength. As of the mid-2020s, it still exists, and it provides a wide variety of programming following its original remit from over 60 years ago. And yet, the disastrous launch night has lived on when looking back at television history. It's almost become like its own folklore tale, a brand new channel gearing up to go before being stopped at the last moment by something completely out of their control. And whilst the original proposed schedule did go ahead as planned the following day, no one can forget the first night that was. A night of long waits with the caption card, news personnel scrambling about in the background to give the anchor something, anything to put to audiences, whilst those behind the scenes tried to get things going again. It's an infamous piece of British television history, one that despite its disastrous origins, has gone on to become quite a pivotal piece of BBC2's story. To round off, summarising the chaos, I think the first person on BBC2, Gerald Priestland, summarises matters best. Producers cursed, public relations men wept, Fleet Street cheered and jeered, and the kangaroo, stuck in a lift, went berserk.
Excuse me, just like Channel 1. Hello? Unlike Channel 1, there's nobody there.
Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Shaun Knock, Dord Khan, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Liam Domain, AJ Mac 200017, Deck, Jen, Traffy, Evan Hart 41, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Marnanel Thurman, John Wakefield, Kieran Bolton, 40-something Manchild, Jerry Ralph, John McLeod, Saint Rocket 9, James Wallace, Ben, Kat Hegarty, Stephen Oliver, Tegan, Shadowfiend 180X, Liam Wigley, Swan Ronson, and Adam Green, our AMTV staff members.